1 in 5 Canadians can't afford their drugs. We can't allow that to continue.
Older Canadians are really concerned that these new regulations are going to prevent them from getting the drugs they need.
So why not sit down at the table and negotiate with the industry and repair the broken relationship that currently exists?
From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, the Zoomer with Marissa Lennox.
Welcome to the Zoomer. I'm Marissa Lennox. The federal government is making changes to how drug prices are set in Canada, a move aimed at reducing the price of patented medicines significantly. Critics fear the changes will discourage pharmaceutical companies from launching new medicines here and deprive Canadians suffering from rare diseases of access to effective but expensive new treatments, while proponents say they're necessary to control the high costs of new medicines. At the roundtable are doctors, patients, advocates, and industry experts from all sides of the debate ready to discuss. But before we dive in, let's tee up the topic.
Ever considered the journey of a new drug in Canada? By all accounts, it's a long road. One of the key steps is a review by a little-known government agency called the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, the PMPRB. Its mandate is to set maximum prices the government is willing to pay for new medicines. Still, Canada pays among the highest drug prices in the world. So, after a 5-year review, the PMPRB is going to change how it sets those ceiling rates. Some have praised the changes as a win for consumer protection, while others fear the PMPRB may drive prices so low that life-saving medicines may no longer come to Canada.
Now, many in our audience may not be familiar with the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. So, Dr. Genge, explain what it is, its role and mandate.
So the Patented Prices Review Board takes every product, every drug that is approved by Health Canada and puts it through a second process. Some of it is a duplication of what Health Canada already does to determine what price they will accept for a drug to enter into the provincial formularies. One of the problems with that is there's often a huge gap between what PMPRB proposes and what the industry who's developed that new drug is expecting as the price point that the provinces will cover.
All right. Dr. Lexchin, will you touch on some of the reforms that are set to be implemented? Your thoughts, what's missing?
Sure. So right now, we compare our prices to 7 other countries, including Switzerland and the United States. Those are 2 of the 3 highest drug prices in the world. The result is that when you look at Canada comparison to all of the industrialized countries in the world, we're about number 4 in terms of the cost of drugs. So we're right at the top. And surveys have shown that up to 1 in 4, 1 in 5 Canadians either can't afford their drugs, split drugs, skip doses, and we need to do something about those high drug prices so that everybody can get the medications that they need.
Now, Brett, you are the CEO of Canadian Health Policy, but you are also a patient with Parkinson's, and so you have some skin in the game here. The PMPRB is a system designed in the 80s. In your opinion, is it still relevant today?
Well, I think under the current regime, prices are about where they should be anyway relative to Canadian incomes and consumer demands. It's the new regulations or the new guidelines that are going to create a problem. Some estimates by the PMPRB itself show that it could cut prices by half. Other estimates, independent studies, have shown that cut prices by up to 84%. And many studies have shown that if that kind of extreme regulation comes about in Canada, like it has in other countries, it will reduce access or availability of new drugs. It'll cause drug companies to delay the launch of new medicines into our country. So as a result, there's some pretty serious risk of reducing availability of medicines in Canada for patients. And so someone like myself, Parkinson's patient who's got an atypical type of Parkinson's, which doesn't respond to existing treatments, I'm forced to wait for access to an innovative product that might come through the pipeline. And if that drug is not launched in Canada or the launch is delayed, it's going to severely affect my potential quality of life. So that's what's at stake here.
Okay, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Dr. Field, in a recent piece, you wrote that the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board regulations are a symptom of a much larger problem that needs to be addressed: the broken relationship between government and the life sciences sector. Describe in more detail this relationship for us. How did we get here?
Sure, Marissa. It really, the underlying issue is what has been for a long time a very adversarial relationship between the industry and the federal government. If we go back to the 80s when PMPRB was first formed, prior to that, the Canadian government didn't even recognize global intellectual property of innovative medicines through a regime called compulsory licensing. So it was only when NAFTA came into play that they struck that deal with the US and they recognized patent protection, global patent protection of innovative products. And PMPRB was formed to make sure that prices were kept in check. And since then, it has been an adversarial relationship debating on whether or not the commitments of the industry around R&D investments have been made. Over that course of that time, the types of R&D investments have changed, the business model has changed, and the industry continues to invest here in Canada, but the pricing regulations and regimes have continued to push product prices down when new medicines, new innovations are coming into play that are much different than what we would typically see in past.
Now, Beth, you've spent the last several years fighting for access to orphan drugs, which are drugs to treat rare diseases that tend to have a fairly high price tag. How has the relationship, in your estimation, between government and Big Pharma impacted your work?
It's been terrible, and I've been fighting specifically for rare disease, CF modulators specifically, for the last 10 years. And rather than things getting better and easier to gain access to medications, things are getting more difficult. And the PMPRB is certainly putting up nearly a blockade to new and innovative medicines coming to Canada and being submitted to Canada. Patients are literally dying while waiting for that. Specifically with CF, we have a new amazing gene modulator, and we've lost countless patients while those drugs have been sitting in limbo and in red tape. And the PMP certainly delayed a lot the submission of one of our drugs, and will perhaps be stopping submissions of further gene modulators that will come down the pipe, or possibly a cure for patients.
And Bill, the government says obviously that this is part of their pledge to take steps toward national pharmacare. As an advocate for national pharmacare, where do you stand on these new PMPRB regulations?
Well, certainly CARP is an advocate for an appropriate national pharmacare, but that doesn't mean the cheapest form and drugs not being available. Our CARP members are very concerned that these new regulations are going to play out just in the way that we've seen with the COVID vaccines recently, where they've seen the inability of Canada to produce them. They fear the same thing is going to happen with other drugs. There has to be a happy medium between the two, and seniors are tired of being the ping pong ball in the middle.
All right, when we come back, does Canada have some of the highest drug spending in the world? We'll discuss.
My concern is companies will stop doing the development in Canada because there is no long-term hope for ever providing the drug to Canadians.
Welcome back. Canada's just weeks away from new federal regulations that will see prices drop for patented medicines. The government says these changes are necessary because Canada pays some of the highest prices for brand name drugs in the world, and overall costs for patented pharmaceuticals are on the rise. Now, Brett, does Canada have the highest drug spending, some of the highest drug spending, I should say, in the world.
Canada spends about $17.2 billion on patented pharmaceuticals, which is only 6.5% of the $264 billion we spend on total healthcare in total. And that's about as high as it was 20 years ago. So there's been a long period of time of relatively trending flat growth. I think by all measures, our prices are moderate.
If you look at the entire OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is the industrialized countries, Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand. Canadian prices are much higher. Our average per capita spending, in other words, how much we spend per person per year on drugs, is about $850. The average for all of those, I think it's about 35 or 36 countries, is about $550. So we're spending considerably more than other countries.
Are we placing enough emphasis on the value of products versus, say, the price?
Absolutely not. Patients need to factor into this. And when I look around globally at countries that have been able to figure this out, I see the problem is within Canada, and setting up barriers and pricing products outside of our country is just taking away access to those who even have private insurance. Those drugs will not be available in Canada. So even if they're not being added to the formulary, they're not going to be available in Canada because of regulations that are setting up at the borders. And I think that all of these drugs are coming through the PNPRB. So if it is a genetic drug that has no other options, there's no other availability, that's going to be kept out too. So I think we have to look at the entire picture, not just 90%.
Dr. Genge, what about the future of R&D in Canada? Will pricing levels impact that?
Well, so it absolutely will affect that. It will affect our entire life sciences industry. Right now, we have patients with rare diseases in Canada whose only access to these novel therapies are through clinical trials. The technological advances are creating therapies where there was none. If you look at the treatment for spinal muscular atrophy, the babies were dying 5 years ago before the age of 2, and now they're living. You can't put a price tag on that kind of success, and yet we're having tremendous difficulty with getting those advances to our rare disease patients. And it will not improve with this PNPRB. My concern is companies will stop doing the development in Canada because there is no long-term hope for ever providing the drug to Canadians.
Dr. Lexchin, I know you're not a spokesperson for the PNPRB, but can I get your reaction to that?
Sure. So let's look at the price of hepatitis C drugs. And let's look at Australia. Australia was being charged about $20,000 to $25,000 Australian per treatment for one of these drugs. Australia went to the drug companies and said, we will guarantee you a market of every person with hepatitis C in the country, but we won't pay $20,000 or $25,000. We'll pay you $7,000. That was over a 60% price reduction, and the drug companies agreed to that. Let's look at drugs for rare diseases. The cost of developing a drug for a rare disease is going to be the same as the cost for developing a drug for something like asthma.
The value of developing these drugs sits on the development of the technology, the development of the failed products before that. And these patients actually want to have access to drugs that are available in other countries. And to have Health Canada review, find the science strong, find the clinical trials very appropriate, give us access through their system, which is quite rigorous, and then have PNPRB re-review and doubt everything Health Canada has done and say, this drug is not worth a certain amount. They're not even looking at actual comparators.
When we come back, what the PNPRB changes mean for access to new medicines, we'll discuss.
We have seen already decisions made, corporate decisions made, to not launch or to delay launches of medicines in Canada, and we've even seen layoffs.
Welcome back. While the PMPRB regulatory changes do not come into effect until July 1st, drug manufacturers and patient advocates have raised concerns in the meantime that such changes will negatively impact access to new and innovative medicines in Canada. Bill, let me come to you first. CARP just released the results of a new survey. What are the main takeaways? I mean, I'm looking at it right now. One thing that stood out to me, 87% want the federal government to ensure that new medicines come to Canada at the same time or faster than other major developed countries. Could PMPRB impact that? Your thoughts?
Yeah. Absolutely. CARP members are really concerned about this issue. And when we did a survey, we had 3,642 people from across the country, from every province, answering this survey. So this is a very complete survey. They're saying a number of things to us. First of all, they say that medicines are extremely valuable to them, and they're very worried about the impact of new drug price controls and their ability to access vaccines and treatment. And they are telling us that they think that the federal government should reconsider the regulations it's talking about putting into place. 65% said that if it was necessary to ease drug pricing rules to spread access to things like the COVID vaccine, that should be applied, but we had to be really careful about what we were doing. 81% said it's important for Canadians to be among the first to have medicines. They don't want to be the last in the world, and that's what they perceive is happening now. 87% say that new medicines should come in a timely fashion and should be available to them, and 80% agree that the new federal pricing regulations should be renewed. And there's a lot of other information in that survey. And anybody that'd like to go and see the detail on carp.ca, you'll find the full survey. Older Canadians are really concerned that these new regulations are going to prevent them from getting the drugs they need.
So, Brett, how valid are these concerns, or is industry bluffing?
Actually, the concerns are supported by the evidence. Drug companies will delay launching new drug products in markets that are heavily regulated on price.
Dr. Lexchin, there were several rounds of intensive consultations to get where we are today. You're hearing the concerns from industry, from Brett, from CARP members. Did government just ignore these concerns? And if so, why? Or are they not valid?
As you said, I'm not speaking on behalf of the PMPRB. I'm not speaking on behalf of the government. What I am speaking on behalf of is rational medical use and being able to afford the drugs that we need. In Denmark, they spend $250 per person per year on drugs compared to the $850 per person per year we spend. I've been in Denmark. There aren't people dropping dead on the street because they don't have access to drugs. I think that people need drugs that are going to help them, and they need drugs that are going to help them at prices that they can afford. Right now, 1 in 4 Canadians or 1 in 5 Canadians can't afford their drugs. We can't allow that to continue.
Well, we won't be able to afford not having the drugs available to Canadians, because then there's nothing to buy. And we've already started to see the impacts of these PMPRB regulations. And we've actually commissioned a third-party research firm, IQVIA, the largest health research firm globally that studies drug launches. And they have collected the data, and we've actually seen the impacts already. In 2019, when these regulations were first implemented, we saw a drop of about 40% in new drug launches. And
that's not true.
It is true.
There were 35 new drugs approved in Canada in 2019. That's about the same as the average.
I'm not debating that, Dr. Lexchin. Approved, that's the key word, approved. Approved does not mean available and marketed. There's a difference, and PMPRB likes to use the approved data because they know it pads the numbers and their narrative. What I'm talking about, and what we're talking about here today, is new medicines, not reformulations, not Me Too drugs. We're talking
I'm not
about
talking about that either.
new innovative
What's-
medicines that are marketed and available. And IQVIA, the study that we used actual sales data to look at the availability of the medicines to patients across jurisdictions. So it's an apples to apples comparison. But we have seen already decisions made, corporate decisions made to not launch or to delay launches of medicines in Canada. Those have already started to happen. And we've even seen layoffs. There are one of our members who have cut their headcount in Canada by a third, citing specifically the regulation, the PMPRB regulations is the reason.
Dr. Genge, let me pull you in here. Your reaction to this?
So this is missing the major reality to patients. And the best example I will use again is spinal muscular atrophy, which has an infantile form, a juvenile form, and an adult form. PMPRB and the company that produces Spinraza spent a very long time reviewing it. It was approved and in the hands of physicians and babies very, very early after the clinical trial was done in the US and in Europe. In Canada, Health Canada reviewed it in an expedited manner. One of the fastest reviews Health Canada has ever done because the results were overwhelming. And yet this drug is still not available to every baby in every province. And the only province that has it available to the older children and adults still, and this is 5-6 years from the beginning of the pivotal trial, is Quebec. So we have PMPRB that wants to control even further the process. So these drugs are even harder to get to the patients. I currently enroll patients in many clinical trials with rare diseases. And I currently tell them when they ask, well, what about if I just wait until the study is done? And I tell them, you wait till the study is done, you may never get this drug in Canada. We had people trying to move to Quebec to get Spinraza, to move their entire families to Quebec because of this discrepancy. And PMPRB drives this discrepancy and is going to drive it further.
Beth, in your experience working with government and drug companies and as an advocate for the CF community, how do you feel this will impact your work?
It's just getting more and more difficult. I don't understand why they feel that the PMPRB setting the prices there is even something we need to do when we already have pricing done at the provincial level with the PCPA. So we have over and over again, things are being repeated, and now they're taking price control out of the provinces, which we have more bureaucracy there, setting up pricing to keep these levels of pricing consistent or reasonable for patients, and they're still taking that out. Also, the Dr. Lexchin mentioned about Australia, I believe, and a drug there. That I understand was looked after inside the country, and there was criteria. So they made sure that the access was going to be available to all patients. That doesn't happen in Canada either. There's so many restrictions placed on these new medications that even when the companies have gone through all of the rigmarole getting into and then getting prescribed, generally such a small portion get these access to these medications through the formulary that it's I don't even know if it's worth it, considering we're only 3% of the market in the world. So if they did something there, we could do some actual problem solving within our borders, saying, okay, these drugs can come in. We're going to make sure that patients that are going to benefit from them will have access. Maybe that would bring prices down a lot too, instead of trying to negotiate them outside of our borders. We don't do that when we have new vehicles brought in, where we decide outside the country what they're going to be able to price those things at. It's worked out inside the country.
All right, stay right there. We'll pick this up on the other side. Don't go away.
I don't see why their intellectual property rights have to be protected only if they spend R&D funds in Canada. No other industry is treated that way in our country.
Welcome Welcome back. We've been discussing new federal regulations aimed at driving down the prices of pharmaceuticals in Canada. Just a reminder for you watching at home, the PMPRB stands for the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, an agency whose mandate is to set the maximum price drug companies can charge for new therapies. Dr. Field, what are some of the other aspects that you anticipate it impacting, particularly around investments in the life sciences sector? Do you anticipate any job loss?
I expect more impacts. We've actually surveyed our members, but the one that is most worrisome to us is what we've been talking about previously, the access to new medicines and delayed drug launches for Canadian patients. So that still remains the top concern for us. I just want to go back to the one comment that Beth had made, about the negotiation that takes place with the PCPA in the Australian example. As Dr. Lexchin was giving that example, what struck me was the fact that the Australian government actually had a conversation, a negotiation with the pharmaceutical industry. And as I said earlier on, the relationship in Canada has been a broken one, and that dialogue and negotiation doesn't take place. Instead, what we have is regulation, very draconian type regulation through the PMPRB that is enforced and imposed upon the industry, rather than actually having a real dialogue and conversation and a negotiation about how to set prices fairly so that Canadians can also have access and investment can continue to be encouraged.
Dr. Lexchin, Canada has always compared itself to wealthy countries like the U.S. What's the rationale for eliminating the U.S. out of that basket?
The rationale is simply that the U.S. has prices that are extreme compared to any other country in the world. The U.S. prices are 2 to 3 times higher than any other place in the world. This is for brand name drugs. I'm not talking about generic drugs. When we go, let me just make a comment about the issue around investment in Canada. Back when Canada eliminated compulsory licensing and set up the PMPRB, the drug companies promised that they would invest 10% of their revenue in R&D. And they actually did that until about the late 1990s. They were up at around 12.5%. Now they're, according to the latest PMPRB report, they're down to about 4%. There are arguments that this doesn't take into account all the other kinds of investments that the industry makes in R&D. So they want clinical trials that take place outside of Canada to count. They want the cost of drugs that are donated. They want contributions that support the arts and other cultural activities in Canada. All of those things are things that the industry thinks should be counted as R&D.
Why is that relevant? Why is it even relevant? PMPRB is the only agency in the world that extracts this promise from the industry. The industry has spent over $26 billion in the last 30 or 40 years on R&D in Canada. And I don't see why their intellectual property rights have to be protected only if they spend R&D funds in Canada. No other industry is treated that way in our country. And no other pharmaceutical industry is treated that way around the world. And it's irrelevant from the point of view of patients. Why would the PMPRB extract a lower price from these companies that results in longer delays or slower launches of new drugs and reduce the availability of drugs for patients, just because the companies are not investing the R&D levels that the government expects them to?
Brett, in a recent Financial Post piece, you link Canada's vaccine procurement efforts to the new federal regulations. You write, the government's inept vaccine procurement strategy during the COVID-19 pandemic is a direct consequence of its pathological hostility toward innovative drug makers. So do you believe our vaccine rollout was a case of Big Pharma servicing last, those who bashed them most, for lack of a better word?
No, I think it's a result of the government's hostility to the industry, which led it to make a deal with a Chinese company, state-owned enterprise, which didn't pan out. We didn't get the needed doses from that company as a result of many complicating foreign affairs factors, perhaps. But the government still made a choice to go with the Chinese company instead of one or more of the companies that have invested so much in Canada over all these years. And so it's a symptom of the overall, what I call pathological hostility toward the industry, which led them into the situation of having to scramble to make contract arrangements with those companies after the fact of having failed with the Chinese firm.
Dr. Genge, do you agree? Do you see a relationship between the two?
Oh, I absolutely see a relationship between the two. And on one hand, the government talks about how important the life sciences industry is to Canada. On the other hand, they're doing everything they can with things like the PMPRB to make it a hostile environment for in the long term. So we have several provinces that have invested significantly in their life sciences industry. We have very active startups that come out of our academic institutions, but they're going to the US for funding. They're starting their trials in the US. They're even small academic startups that are successful see this long-term view of what it takes to get a drug approved in the hands of Canadians, and they can't justify doing their entire development here just to hit a point where what they're doing is not valued. And that lack of value is highlighted by the entire approach of PMPRB. I find it a very difficult thing that Health Canada can do an in-depth review and approve a drug, and that in-depth review is then redone at PMPRB, and the value of that drug is diminished to a point where it's not sustainable for anyone to come here. It's a real problem.
All right, there's more when we return. We'll see you on the other side.
Adding new regulations to solve a problem that doesn't seem to be there just doesn't make sense.
Welcome back. On July 1st, 2021, the government's moving forward with changes to the PMPRB intended to lower the prices of patented medicines in Canada in order to lay the foundation for national pharmacare. So, is this the best path forward, or is there an alternative? Bill, I'll start with you. Do you think that PMPRB and these new reforms and pharmacare are inextricably linked? Can you have one without the other? Are they mutually exclusive? Your thoughts?
Yeah, our members, the lay people that don't have the kind of inside information that we're learning about today, CARP looked at a number of things when we were first looking at this issue. And first of all, we went to CIHI, the Canadian Institute for Health Information, a government organization, nonpartisan, found that for the last 20 years, drug prices have been pretty stable in Canada. We also found that, surprisingly to many of our members, that only between 6 and 8% of the total healthcare cost is drugs. It's not as big a part of the system as they believe. And they realized, and we realized, that the actual cost to our members, to older Canadians across the country, their out-of-pocket expenses were based on a variety of provincial healthcare systems, nothing to do with what we're talking about now. So to talk about adding new regulations to solve a problem that doesn't seem to be there just doesn't make sense to our members.
Dr. Lexchin, is there any merit to the argument that at least these rules should be delayed until after COVID in order to, guarantee that pharmacies, big pharma or pharmaceutical firms don't have their attention divided?
Sure, you can delay the regulations. That just means that you delay how long it is until the 1/4 of Canadians who can't afford their drugs keep not being able to afford them. I can afford my drugs. Delaying the regulations aren't going to hurt me. They're going to hurt my patients because that means that we'll be seeing more people coming into the emergency department because they couldn't afford their drugs. That means that we'll have to dig into the supply of the drugs that the hospital has, because when we can't write a prescription for people because they can't afford it. So sure, let's delay the regulations and let's keep people unable to afford their medications.
Dr. Field, how about that? People can't afford their medications, so what's the alternative?
Yeah, I think we have to dig into that a little bit. And I know this isn't a debate on national pharmacare, but I think when you look closely at the statistics around the affordability of medicines to the majority of Canadians, what we find the actual challenge and problem is that most Canadians are actually covered either through private insurance or through public programs, but not all Canadians are able to access those programs even when they're covered by them. So, programs exist, but the accessibility is sometimes an issue. The actual number of Canadians that aren't covered by programs is a very, very, very small percentage. That really, in my mind, is what needs to be addressed, is those particular gaps, if we're talking about a national pharmacare program. But a national pharmacare program, particularly a universal system, is going to be absolutely useless if we don't have the access to the latest, greatest medicines and technologies that are being developed, that are on the horizon, that are going to be curative in nature in many cases, and have huge impacts for Canadian patients.
What percentage?
So let me just ask you, Dr. Field, how is it that other countries, most other industrialized countries, have lower prices than Canada, but still have universal coverage and keep getting the new medications on the market? How do you resolve that?
I resolve that by saying every jurisdiction is different and has a different makeup. And if you look at different jurisdictions and how they work with pharmaceutical industries and how they look at policy alignment, it's very different than what's happening here in Canada. Canada is a unique jurisdiction that requires a unique solution, and the industry is more than willing to work with government on that. But just hammering prices down with a blunt instrument like these regulations is not the answer. And if you look at any of those jurisdictions, you'll find that it's not the blunt instrument approach. It's actually an approach where they work with the pharmaceutical industry to find models that work.
And they get lower prices. They get prices.
If they're willing to come to the table and work with industry in order to ensure that patients have access, that investments in innovation are recognized in an appropriate way, negotiations and new innovative funding models that are appropriate can be discussed. Absolutely. There is a better way.
Brett, your thoughts on a path forward?
Yeah, well, in regard to pricing, prices internationally tend to follow average income. So it's not a surprise that the absolute price in a country that's poorer than Canada would be lower than Canada. That's appropriate. Wealthy countries like Canada should pay more because average incomes are higher. But the way forward here is what was pointed to earlier in regard to Australia's example. Negotiation between governments and pharmaceutical companies, between public drug plans and pharmaceutical companies is the way to go. Not through regulation. Regulation is going to create severe price cuts that are going to dissuade or discourage the industry from launching drugs in Canada. And that's going to reduce the availability of new medicines here for our patient populations.
Beth, how are rare disease advocates preparing?
Well, we're continuing to raise our voices and try and get these changes halted. Like, they need to be halted. We need a different strategy for getting to ensure that these drugs are getting to patients. Patients need to be at the center of this whole dynamic and heard, and the patient voice is silenced in most of this that's happening. Patients start and participate every step of the way by participating in research trials and raising money for research. And we walk this walk and do everything we can to get to these therapies and perhaps cures one day, and to have them stopped at our borders and not be able to get patients is just beyond frustrating. We need the country to work with us to make these treatments and therapies available, and not work against pharmacy that are actually saving lives and improving lives for patients.
And Dr. Genge, last thought to you here.
So patients need drugs. There are drugs being developed that are cures for diseases that have never been cured before. This is not something you pick up at your local pharmacy. We need to streamline our approach. We need to allow access to these really novel therapies that will change the lives for many Canadians. We would like to save the lives of these Canadians, and we'd like the PMPRB to simply get out of the way.
All right, when we come back, final thoughts, don't go away. Welcome back to the Zoomer. It's time for final thoughts. Bill, we'll start with you.
CARP believes that we really need to balance competitive pricing without putting complex regulations in place that create uncertainty and discourage new medicines and vaccines coming to Canada. This is too complicated, needs to be reestablished and reworked.
Dr. Field?
So I think we can take some lessons from the current COVID-19 pandemic. What the federal government did initially in response to that was to create immediately an exemption to these PMPRB regs because they know that this is a barrier to the access of new medicines. So why not sit down at the table and negotiate with the industry and repair the broken relationship that currently exists?
Brett?
Yeah, I think the government needs to end its hostile approach to the industry and partner with them instead to develop a policy environment that will encourage investment in R&D in Canada and the early launch of new drug products in Canada. And that'll improve the availability of these products and the health potential value that's contained in them for patients here in Canada.
Dr. Lexchin?
Canada needs to do what every other industrialized country that covers hospital costs and physician costs already do, which is establish a universal drug plan and make it affordable. And they can't do that with prices that are significantly above the average of all the other industrialized countries in the world.
Beth?
I think that Canada needs to put patients first and foremost, and they need to work with patients and pharma to find solutions to this so that these medicines are available to all at normal pricing.
And Dr. Genge?
Patients, physicians, and the pharma that want to develop and provide access to novel therapies all need the government to rethink their approach. We have patients who deserve treatments that are being developed for them. We have industries that require the support of the government to allow them to get those drugs to the patients who need them. We need a better approach.
All right, a big thank you to my panelists and to our audience. That's all the time we have. See you next time. For now, it's time to zoom out.